No. My hair's a little wild today. That's okay. Welcome back. We are reading The Wild Edge of Sorrow by Frances Weller, whose name I always forget, even though very easy name to remember. We are on chapter 5, Silence and Solitude, the House of Our Aloneness. I'm in a new room. It feels a little weird. But I'm excited to keep reading. I really love this book. I'm over halfway done, especially since the book actually ends here. So I'm getting closer. I mean, I guess the book actually ends here. It's just a lot of resources and other fun things. So let's dive in. Silence and Solitude, the House of Our Aloneness. The long breath of grief. Throughout the first half of this book, I stressed the value of bringing our grief to others. This move out of isolation is essential for the well-being of our soul life. Far too often we linger in solitary confinement with our sorrows. Bringing our grief into the shelter of close friends and a vibrant ritual community is essential. In this chapter, I will be addressing the other strand of the twining trail and inviting us to enter the house of our aloneness through the practices of silence and solitude. Every one of us lives in the creative tension between belonging and solitude, arcing around this helix in a rhythm that acknowledges the soul's simultaneous need for connection and freedom. In times of deep grief, this rhythm may become altered and exaggerated. We may experience wild oscillations, at times wanting others within reach, when our solitude is an aching territory of loneliness, while at other times we will require the absolute stillness of our own interior landscape, feeling even the barest of contact to be too much. How fluidly we follow these two strands as they twine together affects how well we are able to navigate the terrain of loss. In the long breath of grief, we will inevitably find ourselves facing periods of time alone, chosen or not. Few of us live within a community settings where we have continual access to touch and support. We will in truth spend many of our hours alone with our grief. In the cover of our solitude, we encounter another layer in our apprenticeship with sorrow. Here we are asked to hold an extended vigil with loss in the well of silence, slowly ripening our sorrow into something dense and gifting to the world. Our ability to drop into this interior world and do the difficult work of metabolizing sorrow is dependent on the community that surrounds us. Even when we are alone, it is necessary to feel the tethers of concern and kindness holding us as we step off into the unknown and encounter the wild edge of sorrow. The 13th century Persian poet Jalaluddin Rumi offers an elegant image of the creative tension between intimacy and sovereignty in his poem Bird Wings. Your hand opens and closes and opens and closes. If it were always a fist or always stretched open, you would be paralyzed. Your deepest presence is in every small contracting and expanding, the two as beautifully balanced and coordinated as bird wings. Rumi's image reminds us to listen and stay attentive to the minute alterations in what is being called for. It's a fluid state asking for our finest attention. Many of us struggle with having someone near us when we are in pain. We push away gestures of comfort, preferring solitude, either from feelings of unworthiness or because we worry about how our vulnerability will be met by those around us. Others of us flee from being alone with our suffering. We fear the loud echo of our aloneness and struggle to find our way into a measure of distraction. We stay busy or spend hours on our computers or in front of our televisions. The truth is we need both the vital exhalation of community and the renewing inhalation of our interior lives, for our grief to move and change over the long walk with sorrow. Our healing is in every small contracting and expanding, entering the house of our aloneness. Earlier in this book, I shared the beginning elements in our apprenticeship with sorrow, coming into right relationship with grief, developing a practice to help keep us steady in times of distress, and staying present in our adult selves. Silence and solitude offer the holding space within which we mature these aspects of our learning. They form the vessel for working with the eruptive and difficult material that accompanies grief work. Love, loss, and sorrow pull us inward and downward. There is a natural gravity to sorrow that leads us toward the interior of our lives and nearer to the felt sense of soul. This can feel frightening when we know so little about the territories into which we are being escorted. The guardians of silence and solitude ease our fears and foster a feeling of courage as we move deeper into our experience. Silence and solitude invite us to pause, slow down, and to stop. How rare this is in a culture that revels in continuous motion. We live in a highly extroverted culture in which everything is expressed and exposed at all times of day and night. This has led to a coarsening of our language and a dilution in substance. Mythologist and storyteller Martin Shaw says that we are addicted to disclosure, and yet this pseudo-contact leaves us feeling unseen in the most essential ways. We need to learn the skills of restraint, of holding close to the heart what needs our utmost attention. Without thoughtful hesitation, what precipitates out of our grief will not have had the time to ripen into something worthy of utterance. We are often too quick to reveal, lacking subtlety in what we expose about ourselves. Lacking subtlety in what we expose about ourselves. We suffer from what I call premature revelation, sharing too much too soon, and with little regard for the shyness of the soul. We can also feel pressure from others to reveal what is moving deep within. We must learn to modulate our exposure, allowing things to ripen and mature in the container of the heart before revealing our secret inside flesh to others. In doing so, we will be better able to hear the subtle character and nuanced complexities of our inner life. This is delicate work, requiring a watchful attention to the rhythms of the soul. It is important to distinguish it from isolation and withholding. Those are strategies devised early in our lives to keep hidden what had been shamed or wounded. Many of us had our expressions of suffering silenced. We heard the voices of those we looked to for comfort saying, "We've heard you say this all before, stop repeating yourself. Get over it, stop whining." Or we heard nothing at all. Rarely did we find a refuge for our grief. Similarly, many of us found ourselves isolated in times of loss, shamed by the silent absence of someone who cared. The old strategies of hiding and going silent can quickly come to the foreground whenever grief appears. I remember Alan, a man in his early 60s, who came to see me because he struggled with depression and addiction. He was married and had children, but he found himself living in orbit around the central family hub. He remained detached and aloof, irritable and withdrawn. Laced within his depression was a layer of shame that we were slowly able to untangle. When he was a very young boy, his parents had divorced, and he had rarely seen his father after that. He related this time as one of deep grief, but he had nowhere to take it. A hole took shape in his heart, and the demons of unworthiness took up residence in this place. One day, as we were working, he placed a hand on his chest. I suggested that he pause and notice what was happening there. He said there was a tightness in his chest. I asked him to listen to the tightness and see what it might be about. After a few moments, he shared that an image of a young boy hiding in the woods had come into his mind. He said the boy was playing hide and seek, but no one had come to find him. He couldn't remember if this was a memory or a real event, but the metaphor stopped him and brought him to tears. No one had come to look for him in this time of sorrow, and he had been hiding ever since. In this tender moment, Alan was able to tell the boy that he was there and that he had found him. It is essential for us to recognize the childhood wounds associated with grief and to find our way back into the current moment. Only in the adult body will we be able to cultivate a mindful awareness of when to expand into the embrace of a friend or loving community and when to contract into the sanctuary of our solitude, as beautifully coordinated as bird wings. How do we approach our time in the interior? We turn again to the thought of John O'Donohue and his call for a reverence of approach. An approach of reverence offers the gentleness and patience to coax our sorrows into our open arms. Inside this perspective is a hidden promise. When we approach our inner lives with reverence, something great will approach us. This is a marvelous intimation, offering us reassurance that our time in the depths will yield something of great value. Many spiritual traditions hold silence and solitude as central to the life of soul. Practices such as meditation, contemplation, prayer, and vision quests were designed to open the individual to the wilder and wider cosmos, both within and without. Many myths tell us that we will find ourselves from time to time alone and separated from all that is familiar. How we use these times will affect the richness of our return. We can come back to the world thickened, deepened, and opened by our time in silence and solitude. Those who undertake the full journey into their grief come back carrying medicine for the world. For many of us, however, our first encounter with silence and solitude during times of grief is not by choice. We are taken into this territory unwillingly, feeling as if we have been severed from the mainland, our lives now an archipelago of sorrow. Silence and solitude are painful reminders of loss. The house is silent in the wake of a partner's death, his or her words no longer filling the air with conversation. Solitude becomes a prison sentence, an inescapable confinement that feels void of joy and warmth. Filled with an absence where the shape of the beloved once moved and touched our lives, we too, in the wake of this departure, feel absent and empty. Silence and solitude are imposed upon us, falling like ash around us, dulling the world and leaving all things we touch with the mark of our emptied hands. Only gradually do we begin to see the necessity of silence and solitude. This long pilgrimage helps us learn to value the house of our aloneness. We slowly realize a new intimacy is taking shape, forged with our soul life, mediated through loss and sorrow. The rupture that occurs with significant loss often precipitates a separation from the ordinary world. The constant din of activity, technology, schedules, and noise are too intrusive to our vulnerable, sorrow-drenched heart. The heart shuns the garish display of our neon society, seeking instead places of solace and quietude. We don't fit in the commodified world during these eras of grieving. The soul longs for, in fact, it requires a spaciousness that comes through silence and solitude to simply catch its breath and come to a stop when the demands around us remain ceaseless. It is a brooding, incubating time when we are asked to break the compulsivity of doing and achieving and our obsession with productivity. A man I worked with, a doctor in his 60s, could not stop and tend the profound sorrow in his heart over the death of a dear friend. The demands of his daily workload had him at the hospital 5:30 in the morning till 7 every night, then when he stumbled home exhausted. There was no room for his sadness or grief. He had to keep up the fevered pitch and not fall behind in the machinery of healthcare. He was not alone. This is our predicament. We are forever feeling pressed by our society to meet its demands while the yearnings of the soul, especially in times of great grief, go unmet. Our apprenticeship requires that we find moments, that we take the time to create a moment here and there, unhurried, silent, and open to what is present. A moment in the early morning as the day announces itself to us, a pause that allows us to notice the beauty of sunlight on the maple outside our window. In the deep still of the night, we can enter the loom of silence and see what is there, waiting to be woven into our lives, longing for our attention. I know that the call to slow down and listen is not always easy or desired. In times of loss, the space that awaits us in silence is often filled with emotions, memories, and reminders of things that are difficult to embrace. Still, they are there, awaiting our attention and affection. One woman shared during her work with me that she dreaded dusk, as it was the harbinger that brought the shadow of her loneliness into the foreground following the end of her marriage. As we sat with her fear and pain, I suggested that she consider the possibility of imagining this time as a holy hour, a threshold moment revealing to her what is most vulnerable in her world, what was most in need of her kindness and compassion. Here was the lonely interior sister aching to be seen and held. I shared with her a line from the poet Rilke. I am too alone in the world and not alone enough to make every minute holy. How true. So many of us carry the outcast sister or brother of loneliness. And if we can move one step deeper into our silence and solitude, we might be able to make the moment holy and redemptive, calling the outcast parts of us home and causing the anxious edge of avoidance to slowly diminish. Silence and solitude are essential during our work with grief. They renew us, washing off the encrusted shell that befalls us as we speed through our days. They are acts of protest against the breathless pace that is so endemic to modernity. In the space of silence and solitude, we enter a holy region where the deep work of healing occurs. Silence, writes social critic John Zezrin, like darkness, is hard to come by, but mind and spirit need sustenance. Silence invites us into a space of deep listening, a place of humility and not knowing. In this place of wordlessness, we are able to hear and honor the voices of those more subtle and quiet pieces of our inner world, the outcast brothers and sisters, the neglected parts of soul, forgotten ancestors, and the beckoning speech of the surrounding world. Listening is worship, writes audiologist Gordon Hempton, through which we register the actual shape and song of the world. Listening in turn grants the courtesy of attention. We come to recognize that every aspect of our interior life is worthy of our time and affection and appreciation. Attention slowly brings us into the shelter of intimacy, the tangled nest of conversation between body, heart, soul, and world. As psychologist Robert Sardello writes, the most basic experience of silence is intimacy. Silence is a secret discipline that infuses our lives with unexpected meetings. Silence is a practice of emptying, of letting go, is a process of hollowing ourselves out so we can open to what is emerging. Our work is to make ourselves receptive. The organ of receiving is the human heart, and it is here that we feel the deep ache of loss, the bittersweet reminders of all that we loved, the piercing artifacts of betrayal, and the sheer truth of impermanence. Love and loss, as we know so well, forever entwined. Solitude is a slow bow to the soul's need for time alone. Our times apart, especially when we are sitting with the inky cloak of grief around our shoulders, separates us from the conscripted agreements we hold with the dominant culture. Clarissa Pinkola Estes calls these agreements the overculture, with its attendant requirements of passivity, domestication, and compliance. Grief, as I have mentioned, is anything but passive. It has a wild and irrepressible energy rising from the deep well of soul. In the alchemical vessel of our solitude, this vital energy reduces us to the foundations of our being, stripping us of images and persona. What slowly emerges from the darkened room is an interior friendship with our own authentic being. Within the folds of our solitude, we unexpectedly discover the roots of genuine hospitality. Solitude is the foundation for kinship. As Rilke noted in his letters to a young poet, love consists of two solitudes which border, protect, and greet each other. During our vigil in the depths, we are being prepared for the great work of loving again. David White offers this revelation from his poet 10 years later. One small thing I've learned these years, how to be alone, and at the edge of aloneness, how to be found by the world. Our time in silence and solitude does not divide us from the world. We are ripened in the depths, made more completely who we are during this sojourn into the place of our sorrows. As White says, we are found by the world in a place of our aloneness. We come to see the necessity of this time in the interior world. Eventually we are ready to return, ready to be in the world once again, following our work with sorrow. Our grief has yielded a wisdom that can see into the way the world shapes us through our times of loss. Psychologist Robert Romanishin speaks to this as the value of melancholy. He describes it as the result of a grief endured, the deep wisdom of the soul which recognizes that life is about loss, and love tempered by grief allows one to cherish the ordinary, simple moments of everyday life, even as we know they are passing away. The work in the deep, turning toward our sorrows. Silence and solitude allow us to move beyond thought and into our embodied experience. Grief is felt, sensed in the viscera of our bellies, the inner walls of our chests, the curve of our shoulders, the heaviness of our thighs. Grief is registered in our sinews and muscles. It feels labored as though a great weight has settled on our chest or heaviness has entered our bones. We know grief by its felt experience. It's tangible. It is here, in our sighing and sensing body, that we encounter the terrain of sorrow. Grief rises and falls with every breath, clinging to the chambers of the heart, and makes each step we take a challenge. It is a dense space filled with sensations that carry our tears and our palpable aching. We cannot escape these times. We cannot outrun what is so intimately entangled in our moment-to-moment world. It is now that our apprenticeship is most called upon. We are asked to stand alongside these difficult and painful visitations, these epiphanies of lamentation. Turning our attention toward the ways we sense our sorrow is a necessary and healing move. It is a form of primary knowing, eclipsing all abstractions and bringing the immediacy of our experiences to the present moment. Kate, a woman in her mid-50s, was working with the difficult memory of her mother's suicide, which occurred when she was only 16 years old. As she shared her memories, I could see that she was holding herself tight. She was barely breathing. I invited her to take a few moments and simply notice her body and the sensations that were present as she spoke. She became quiet and noticed what she was experiencing, the felt sense of it as it coalesced in her body. As she settled into a state of soft attention, she noticed a heaviness that was present. I then asked if she could check in with her body and see what this heaviness was all about. After a few minutes of silence, she said that the heaviness was about fear. No one was with her when she found her mother's body. I asked if she could welcome this part of her that was holding the fear. She said she could. As she did so, her tears began to fall. No one had ever turned toward her and held her in the feelings she carried at the painful discovery of her mother's lifeless body. For the first time, in the solitude of her felt experience, she was offering a level of attunement so long missing from her experience. When she came out of her inner world, her eyes looked softer, suppler, and her breathing was easier. The tight and rigid posture had begun to change through the choice she made to turn toward the pain. Kate made a powerful move by entering into her bodily experience. We cannot figure our way out of grief. We cannot use information or concepts to somehow reduce our experience of pain. As the adage goes, the only way out is through. We must turn toward our experience and touch it with the softest hands possible. Only then, in the inner terrain of silence and solitude, will our grief yield to us and offer up its most tender shoots. This move is another form of sacred ritual, crafted in the moment and consecrated by the grace of compassion. So much is carried in our bodies. The wisdom that is held within our tissues is something that we have almost completely forgotten. And yet there is no awareness more situated in the present moment than what is found in our bodies. Reginald Ray, author of Touching Enlightenment, Finding Realization in the Body, says that with our body, we are in the presence of a force and intelligence that is filled with wisdom, that is loving, flawlessly reliable, and strange to say, worthy of our deepest devotion. Grief work must incorporate a deep connection with our physical lives in order to perceive the ways in which our sorrow has taken up residence in our bodies. Ray adds, when we begin to inhabit the world as our primary way of sensing, feeling, and knowing the world, when our thought operates as no more than a handmaiden of the somatic way of being, then we find that we as human beings are in a state of intimate relationship and connection with all that is. I'm going to read that again. When we begin to inhabit the body as our primary way of sensing, feeling, and knowing the world, when our thought operates as no more than a handmaiden of the somatic way of being, then we find that we as human beings are in a state of intimate relationship and connection with all that is. Grief leads us back to the body through its wild, turning, heavy, twisting presence, and through the body we are brought back into the greater conversation with the living world. Silent solitude and endurance, anchoring the change. During the intense winter of sorrow, we yearn for things to change. We long for a single breath of fresh air in our lungs. Carl Jung suggested that change rested upon 3 principles: insight, endurance, and action. Often in my work with people, I ask that they take time to sit with what has been stirred. We frequently have insights during our time together, new ways of seeing our lives, the ways wounds show up in times of conflict, our styles of intimacy, about the way we respond to the touch of loss. These insights come quickly and suddenly, like a flash, a flirt, a dream. We are moved by these visitations and feel quickened by the power of the revelation. Our failure to tend these insights, however, often leads to their disappearance. Frequently, people come back to me and moan, "I know we've touched something powerful last week, but I can't for the life of me remember what it was." Endurance asks us to keep the insight in front of us, to think about it, write about it, mull it over, draw it, dance it, talk about it with a close friend. Whatever it takes to not let it slide off the table like last night's dream. And then, only then, after a prolonged time of engagement with the insight, we might witness a new gesture erupting into the world. This is how it is with sorrow. It takes our prolonged attention, weighed out over months and possibly years, for it to yield something new and fresh into the world. This is the work of our apprenticeship. We must become skillful in the ways that promote our capacity to pay attention and keep our insights alive and fresh. Endurance requires steadfastness and stability. We must be mindful of how quickly we can lose sight of the new understanding and slip back into our habitual modes of seeing and acting. We can forget that our grief requires support and friendship and quickly pull back into the familiar territory of going it alone. Jung said that psychology can only be helpful with the stage of insight. Beyond that, however, endurance and action require moral strength as the predominant requirement. We all know how difficult it is to truly change our character. To do so requires a degree of courage and a willingness to walk into the shadowed territories of our lives, facing our losses. The outcast parts of us that carry shame, regrets, and defeats demand a fortitude of spirit. This is abundantly clear in times of grief. To hold our grief in front of us and tend it with time, patience, and compassion is an act of great devotion, is an act of heart. In the long run, change is as much devotional as it is psychological. It is out of love that we ultimately reshape our lives. It is a matter of discipline, a word which, as I tell most of the people I work with, has the same root as the word disciple. In other words, to what will we be devoted? What is it that we will love and serve? The hope is our soul. Challenges remain in our work with grief. Challenges. The eddies that take us away from our courageous heart and back into isolation will frequently swirl around us. We will be pulled into our complexes on many occasions. The societal mandates of stoic striving will deny us the richness of our solitude and the beauty of being held by others. Understanding the many ways that our grief becomes congested helps us move ever more deeply toward a life of soul. Let us look more closely at the obstacles on this path. Okie dokie, we're on to chapter 6, page 103. Pushing through solid rock. And I think, let's see. I think we have 4 chapters left. We're getting closer. Thanks for joining me. Talk to you soon.